was 13 years old when my brother Tommy died in Vietnam, and even now, decades later, I still measure the before and after of my life by that moment. Before the telegram, before my mother's scream echoed through the house like something feral, before my father stopped talking in full sentences. Tommy had been everything I wasn't: confident, athletic, fearless. He flew helicopters because he loved the sky, loved the idea of mastering something vast and dangerous. When the Army doctors told us he managed to land his helicopter after taking a bullet before collapsing, my father called it a miracle. But miracles don't usually end in funerals. 5 years passed before our home felt livable again. 5 years before laughter didn't feel like betrayal. And then came the draft. By the time I turned 18, America was still chewing through young men, and my parents were terrified they'd be asked to bury another son. A family friend pulled some strings through the church, and I was offered a scholarship to study theology at the University of Maine. Seminary meant exemption. It meant safety. What no one expected, not even me, was that faith would actually take. Studying scripture didn't erase my grief, but it gave it a place to sit. It made the world feel ordered again, like suffering had edges instead of being endless. When the time came to leave the seminary and return home, I surprised everyone by staying. Service felt right, necessary. That calling is what brought me to Ashby, Virginia, in the late spring of 1977. Ashby isn't its real name. I promised a man long ago that I'd protect the innocent if I ever told this story properly. But if you've ever driven through Appalachia, you already know the place I'm describing. A coal town tucked between highways and haulers, surrounded by narrow valleys that feel less like geography and more like veins, arterial, alive. Coal was booming then. The oil crisis had turned Ashby into a magnet for work-hungry families, and the town was swelling faster than it could handle. 2 churches served the adults well enough, but there was no Sunday school to speak of. Too many children, not enough hands. The Maine Council of Churches wanted to change that. They called it the Schoolhouse Project, a traveling ministry for underprivileged communities. Florida had one, Oklahoma too. Arkansas. Ashby was meant to be the 4th. I accepted without hesitation. I rented a single room in a boarding house near the edge of town and spent my first week introducing myself to preachers, miners, and anyone else who would listen. With their blessing, I set up a simple tent behind one of the churches, folding chairs, a chalkboard, and whatever patience God could lend me. On the first Sunday, I expected maybe a dozen children. I got nearly 40. Parents stood at the edges, watching with cautious approval. Kids crowded the entrance, some barefoot, some still chewing breakfast. I taught Jonah and the whale that day, how even when everything feels lost, you're not beyond saving. They loved it. Word spread fast. By the second week, parents were bringing lawn chairs, crates, anything to sit on. Ashby was poor, but generosity came easily. Through those families, I learned the town, its rhythms, its silences. And I learned about Joshua. Joshua was 7, maybe 8, small for his age, quiet. His mother, Mary Ann, lived in a trailer at the edge of town, close enough to the woods that the tree line felt like it was watching. She rarely spoke more than necessary. Dropped him off, picked him up, grateful but distant. When Joshua missed 2 Sundays in a row, I noticed. Children disappear easily in places like Ashby. Work is hard, supervision is flexible. Still, something gnawed at me. I called her mother's trailer from the boarding house phone. She said he'd been sick, nothing serious. When he returned the following Sunday, he looked drained, pale, as if sleep hadn't touched him in weeks. After handing out paper and crayons, I pulled him aside and asked him how he was feeling. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "I was sick," he said. "What kind of sick?" He shrugged. "The kind where you gotta sleep." That seemed harmless enough. Children get sick. They dream strange dreams. I was ready to send him back to his seat when he stopped me. "Can I tell you something?" I nodded. He told me that when he first fell asleep, when he was too weak to stand, he dreamed he was walking through a forest of underpants trees. I laughed before I could stop myself. So did he. I asked him to repeat it, thinking I'd misheard. "Underpants trees?" he said again. He explained that clothes hung from the branches like fruit, old ones, faded, and from behind the trunks came make-do dolls. If you're not from Appalachia, a make-do doll might sound harmless, something quaint. But here, they're scraps stitched into shapes, faces sewn on sacks, stuffed with whatever's left over, folk art born from scarcity. Joshua said the dolls played with him. If I dreamed like that every time I got sick, I wouldn't mind being sick. Then his smile faded. After, he added, I felt worse, slept longer. I told him he had an imagination that would take him far, that dreams were just dreams. He thanked me, turned to leave, then he said softly, "I hope next time I don't have to sleep in the woods again." Something inside me went cold. I finished the lesson on instinct alone. When Mary Ann arrived, I couldn't look at her. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, I called the county sheriff. A deputy, young, polite, came by the boarding house. I'll call him Isaac. He listened carefully, then sighed. Taken care of means different things here. If we charged every parent who let a kid wander into the hollers, we'd arrest half the county. Still, he promised to check. A few days later, Isaac called back. Joshua had collapsed in the woods. His mother found him after dark, nursed him back to health. No neglect case, no further action. I told myself that was the end of it. For 6 weeks, nothing happened. Then, the fire burned in Godby Holler.
The fire in Godby Holler burned for nearly 12 hours. By the time the sun came up, smoke still clung to the trees like a low, dirty fog, and ash drifted across Ashby as if the holler itself were exhaling. Folks gathered in quiet knots outside the grocery store, trading theories in hushed voices. Some said teenagers, some said lightning. A few, mostly the older ones, said it was about time. Godby Holler had been abandoned for nearly a century. After the plague took it, the surviving families fled, and the county quarantined what was left. Houses were nailed shut, windows boarded. Later, when people realized the sickness wasn't coming back, someone tried to burn the place down, tried, and failed. Nature reclaimed most of it. Vines strangled porches, trees split through rooftops, but a handful of houses remained, stubborn and skeletal, hidden beneath decades of growth. No one went there, except, apparently, Joshua. I didn't learn that right away. What I learned first was that the fire hadn't destroyed much. The brush burned hot, but fast. When the crews went in at dawn, they found something strange. One of the old plague houses had burned clean, not collapsed, not half gone, clean. The walls were blackened, but intact. The door, long since nailed shut, had been forced open from the inside. That bee pail bothered me more than it should have. Over the next few days, Joshua stopped coming to Sunday school again. This time, I didn't wait. I walked to the trailer myself. Mary Ann looked worse than the last time I'd seen her, dark circles under her eyes, hands shaking as she held the doorframe. When I asked about Joshua, she hesitated too long. "He's resting," she said. "Can I see him?" She shook her head. "Doctor said he needs quiet." There was no doctor in Ashby who made house calls. Before I could press her, something moved behind her, just a shape passing down the narrow hallway. For a moment, I thought I saw fabric dragging across the floor. She closed the door gently but firmly. That night, I dreamed of trees hung with clothes that didn't belong to anyone. I woke before dawn and called Isaac. He met me near the edge of Godby Holler, where the crews had cut a rough path through the undergrowth. He didn't like being there. I could tell by the way his eyes kept moving, scanning the trees as if they expected them to shift. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "Neither should Joshua." Isaac sighed. "We didn't find footprints, not small ones anyway, but we did find things." He led me closer. Charred fabric hung from branches like tattered flags, children's clothes, shirts, socks, underwear. They hadn't burned, they'd been placed. My stomach turned. "Why hasn't anyone reported this?" I asked. "Because if we open this can, it doesn't close again." We followed the path deeper, past the burned house. That's when I saw them. Shapes half buried in the ash, arranged in a loose circle. Make-do dolls. Dozens of them. Some were old, some new, all stitched with the same crude smiles, stuffed with rags, straw, and things I didn't want to identify. The fire had scorched them, but not destroyed them. At the center of the circle was a patch of earth worn smooth, as if something had slept there many times. Isaac swallowed. "We're calling this in." By the time deputies arrived, the dolls were gone. Every single one. No tracks, no explanation. The official report blamed vandals. Locals blamed God. Joshua was found 2 days later, not in the holler, in his bed. He looked peaceful, they said, as if sleeping. The coroner listed exhaustion complicated by exposure. No charges were filed. Marianne left town within the week. The tent stood empty the following Sunday. Parents came anyway. They sat quietly, hats in hands, waiting for something, anything that would make sense of it all. I taught, but my voice felt hollow. Afterwards, an old woman approached me. I'd seen her before, always at a distance. "You should have listened," she said. "To what?" "To the dolls. They only take what's offered." Then she walked away. I left Ashby at the end of summer. I told myself it was time, that my work was done, that some places carry wounds too deep to heal. Years passed. I married, served other communities, built a life that felt normal enough. Until last winter. A package arrived with no return address. Inside was a small cloth doll, crudely stitched, smelling faintly of smoke. Pinned to it was a scrap of paper. "He doesn't sleep alone anymore." I burned it. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet, I swear I hear fabric brushing against the trees outside. And I pray that Godby Holler stays hungry. I told myself that burning the doll was the end of it. That whatever had followed me out of Appalachia had lost its grip once the cloth turned to ash. I scattered the remains into the trash, washed my hands until the smell of smoke faded, and went back to my life. Sunday sermons, charity drives, hospital visits, the quiet, dependable rhythm of service. For a while, it worked. Then children started getting sick. Not in my town all at once, not in any way that would raise alarms, just stories, drifting in from neighboring counties. A boy found asleep under a tree, unable to wake. A girl discovered wandering barefoot at dawn, wrapped in clothes that weren't hers. Always exhaustion, always confusion, always parents insisting their child had been playing in the woods. I told myself it was coincidence, until I heard the word dolls again. It came from a volunteer nurse during a church fundraiser. She spoke casually, like it was nothing worth lingering on. "Sweet kid," she said, "kept talking about dolls watching him while he slept.
Guess he was delirious. That night, I dreamed of Godby Holler. The trees were closer together than I remembered. Their branches sagged under the weight of clothing, tiny shirts, socks, underwear, swaying gently though there was no wind. Between them stood the dolls, dozens of them, stitched smiles pulled too wide, their button eyes fixed on me. I woke with the certainty that this was not memory. It was invitation. I called Isaac for the first time in years. The number still worked. He sounded older, tired. "You shouldn't have burned it," he said after I told him about the package. I did what I thought was right. They don't like being ignored. I asked him why nothing had ever come of the investigation, why no one had dug deeper. There was a long pause. "Because we found records, church records, old ones." The plague hadn't taken Godby Holler all at once. Families tried to care for the sick themselves. Children fell ill first, fevers, weakness, long periods of sleep. The adults believed the land was cursed, so they made offerings. Dolls, each one sewn to resemble a child who hadn't woken up yet. They hung the clothes in the trees so the sickness would recognize them and pass over the living. It worked. For a time. What happened when the children died anyway? I asked. Isaac exhaled slowly. They didn't bury them. The line went dead. 3 days later, a boy collapsed outside my church. His parents said he'd been fine that morning, just tired. He'd wandered off during the service, and they found him near the tree line, asleep on the cold ground. When I knelt beside him, his skin felt cool despite the summer heat. In his hand, clutched tight, was a scrap of cloth. Stitched into it was a crooked smile. That night, I locked every door and window. It didn't matter. I heard the sound just after midnight, fabric brushing bark, soft footsteps that didn't quite touch the ground. When I looked out the bedroom window, the trees at the edge of the property were wrong, too close, too crowded. And hanging from their branches were clothes I recognized, old Sunday school donations, lost and found items that had vanished over the years. Between the trunks, the dolls stood in a wide circle. In the center was a space left open, waiting. I prayed harder than I ever had in my life. I quoted scripture until my throat burned. I promised anything, everything, if God would just make it stop. The dolls did not move. They watched. And then I understood. They weren't hunting. They were collecting. The old woman's words came back to me. They only take what's offered. Ashby had offered its children out of fear. I had offered mine out of neglect. Every time I laughed off a nightmare, every time I told a parent it was just imagination, every time I chose peace over confrontation, the circle tightened. I stepped outside. The air smelled of smoke and damp earth. The dolls leaned inward, expectant. In their stitched faces, I saw Joshua's smile, Tommy's courage, every child I had failed to protect. "I'm here," I said, my voice barely holding. "Take me." The dolls did not answer. Instead, the trees shuddered, and the clothes fell, one by one, to the ground. The dolls turned away. When I woke the next morning, the yard was empty. No trees, no fabric, no dolls. The boy recovered within the week. The reports stopped after that.
I resigned from active ministry not long after. I still serve, in quieter ways, safer ones. I no longer work with children alone. I never dismiss fear, no matter how small. And when people ask why I won't travel through Appalachia anymore, I tell them the truth. Some places remember what you give them. And some debts once paid do not ask again. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm almost asleep, I feel the pull of the woods, and I know Godby Holler is still there, waiting for the next offering.
The first thing you should understand about Blackroot Chapel is that it was never meant to last. It sat at the end of a gravel road that didn't appear on most maps, tucked so deep into the hills of eastern Kentucky that even the radio signal faded before you reached it. The building itself was small, white paint gone yellow, steeple leaning just enough to make you nervous, but it had stood there since the 1920s, long after the mining camp it served had vanished. By the time I arrived, the chapel was already dead. Not officially, not on paper, but the congregation had dwindled to 7 regulars, all over the age of 60, and even they spoke about the place in the past tense. When the chapel was full, when the singing could be heard down the valley. I wasn't supposed to be there long. The diocese had sent me as a temporary caretaker, 3 months, maybe 4. Keep the doors open, hold Sunday service, decide whether the property was worth saving or better off surrendered to the woods. I told myself it was just another assignment. I was wrong. Blackroot Hollow earned its name honestly. The trees grew too close together, their roots breaking through the soil like knuckles. Even in daylight, the forest pressed in, swallowing sound. When I first unlocked the chapel doors, the silence inside felt heavier than the quiet outside, like the building had been holding its breath. The pews were dusty but orderly, hymnals stacked neatly, no signs of vandalism, no graffiti. That alone should have worried me. Abandoned places are rarely respected. Behind the altar hung a wooden cross, hand-carved, dark with age. At its base, someone had tied strips of black cloth, dozens of them, knotted tight around the wood. I assumed mourning ribbons, old ones, left behind. I didn't touch them. The first service drew 5 people. They sat spaced apart, coats still on, eyes fixed forward. They sang quietly, carefully, as if afraid of being overheard. When I introduced myself, they nodded politely but offered no warmth, no questions, no welcome lunch. After the benediction, Mrs. Hale lingered. "You shouldn't stay after dark," she said. "I've got the parsonage, just up the road." She shook her head. "Doesn't matter." That night, I heard singing. It started just after midnight, low, tuneless humming drifting through the trees. I thought it was the wind until I recognized the melody. What a friend we have in Jesus. It was coming from the chapel. I told myself it was memory, stress, the mind filling silence with familiarity. Still, I didn't sleep much after that. The second Sunday, attendance dropped to 4. After the service, one of the men, a former miner named Caldwell, asked if I'd noticed anything strange. "Like what?" I asked. He glanced toward the altar. "The ribbons." I admitted I had. "They're not mourning ribbons," he said. "They're markers." "For what?" "For who didn't come back." He didn't explain further. Midweek, I explored the chapel basement. The stairs creaked under my weight, each step reluctant. The air grew colder as I descended, carrying the scent of damp earth and old wood. Against the far wall stood a row of hooks, empty now, but stained dark beneath them. I found hymn sheets stacked neatly on a table, handwritten. Names scribbled in the margins, dates going back decades. Every name was crossed out. That night the singing returned, louder this time, joined by something else. Footsteps, slow, measured, circling the chapel. I watched from the parsonage window as lantern light flickered between the trees. Figures moved just beyond clear sight, their shapes distorted by roots and shadow. They never stepped into the open. They never had to. The next morning, Mrs. Hale was waiting on the chapel steps. "You heard them," she said flatly. "Yes." She nodded. Then it started. She told me Blackroot Chapel used to hold midnight services during the Depression, miners working double shifts, families desperate for protection. They prayed through the night, begging God to keep the mountain from taking any more men. But something answered. Something that demanded attendance. If you missed a service, you were marked. If you tried to leave, you were followed. Over time, people stopped asking who the services were for. They just came. "And now?" I asked. "Now there's too few of us left, and it doesn't like that." That evening, I found a new strip of black cloth tied to the cross. Fresh. Still damp. Pinned to it was a slip of paper with a name written in careful script.
I stood at
Mine.
the altar for a long time, staring at my own name. The paper was old, yellowed, brittle at the edges, but the ink was fresh, still dark, still wet enough that it had bled slightly into the fibers. Whoever had written it hadn't done so in haste. The letters were careful, reverent, as if naming something sacred. I asked Mrs. Hale about it after the others left. She didn't look surprised. "It writes the names itself," she said. "Uses the hands of whoever's still willing." "That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting." I took the paper down and folded it into my pocket. That night, I locked the chapel doors for the first time since I'd arrived. It felt childish, but necessary, as if wood and iron could assert a boundary faith alone suddenly couldn't. I slept in the parsonage with the lights on. The singing began earlier than before. Not hymns this time, just breathing voices, rising and falling together, as though the forest itself were inhaling. I pressed my ear to the window and heard footsteps again, more of them now, circling, pausing, testing. Then came the knock, not loud, not demanding, patient. I didn't answer. The knock came again, this time closer to the door. A third time, nearer still, though I hadn't heard any steps on the porch. I stayed frozen in my chair until morning light finally thinned the trees. Sunday arrived heavy and gray. Only 3 congregants showed up. Caldwell was missing. Mrs. Hale sat rigid in the front pew, hands folded so tightly her knuckles had gone white. The remaining man, Eli, kept glancing at the door. "We should cancel," I said quietly. Mrs. Hale shook her head. "If we don't hold service, it will." I delivered the sermon on autopilot, my voice sounding far away even to myself. Halfway through, the chapel door creaked open. No one entered, but the temperature dropped sharply, breath fogging in the air. The black ribbons at the cross began to sway, though the windows were closed. When the service ended, Eli stood abruptly. "I can't do this anymore. I'm leaving today." Mrs. Hale didn't try to stop him. She just whispered, "Don't go home." He laughed once, short and brittle, and walked out.
That evening I followed Mrs. Hale to the edge of the hollow. She moved slowly, deliberately, leaning on a walking stick worn smooth with age. We stopped where the trees grew so thick the ground beneath them never saw sunlight. "This is as far as I go," she said. "What happens to him?" She didn't answer directly. "Blackroot doesn't take people," she said instead. "It takes attendance, takes witness. The service must continue, or it will collect what's owed. And when there aren't enough people?" Her eyes met mine. "Then it starts writing new names." That night, the singing swelled into something almost joyful. Lanterns bobbed between the trees, dozens of them now, casting long, broken shadows across the chapel walls. I watched from inside as figures gathered, men, women, some so thin they looked hollowed out. Their faces were wrong, stretched just slightly too far, eyes reflecting light like glass. They took their seats, filled every pew, and waited. I stood at the pulpit because there was nowhere else to stand. The service began without me speaking. Hymns I hadn't called rose from their mouths, perfectly in tune, perfectly timed. I recognized the voices of people long dead, past caretakers, former miners, names from the crossed-out hymn sheets in the basement. At communion, no bread was offered, only names. A ledger appeared on the altar, pages flipping on their own. I saw Caldwell's name added, still faint, like it hadn't settled yet. I slammed the book shut. "I won't do this. This isn't service." The congregation rose as one. The pressure in the room became unbearable, like standing underwater. I felt hands at my back guiding me, not roughly, but insistently towards the cross. Mrs. Hale's voice cut through the noise. "You don't have to finish it." I turned to her. "Then how does it end?" She stepped forward, untying one of the black ribbons from the cross. Her hands shook, but her voice didn't. "By closing the chapel. For good." She placed the ribbon in my hands. "Someone has to be the last." The singing stopped. Every face in the room twisted, not in anger, but in hunger. The lanterns went out all at once. In the dark, something leaned close to my ear and whispered my name.
The darkness didn't lift when the lanterns went out. It pressed inward instead, thick and suffocating, like the inside of a closed fist. I could still feel the ribbon in my hands, coarse fabric, damp with something warm. The whisper of my name lingered near my ear, repeated softly, patiently, as though whatever spoke it had all the time in the world. I don't know how long we stood there. Then Mrs. Hale began to sing. Her voice was thin, cracked by age, but steady. She chose an old hymn, one I hadn't heard since childhood. The melody cut through the dark like a line thrown across deep water. Slowly the pressure eased, the whispering stopped. A single lantern flickered back to life near the altar. The congregation was still there, but they looked diminished, their forms less certain, as if they were losing cohesion. "This place feeds on continuation," Mrs. Hale said softly, never breaking the hymn. "Every sermon tells it the world still needs it." I understood then. Blackroot Chapel wasn't haunted, it was sustained by fear, by habit, by people too afraid to stop coming. "What happens if we end it?" I asked. She met my eyes. "Then it starves." The ledger slammed open on the altar.
Pages flipped violently now, names appearing and disappearing at rapid succession. Caldwell's name darkened, then blurred. Others followed, dozens, hundreds. The building groaned. The walls shuddered as if something beneath them was shifting, awakening. The ribbons on the cross tightened further, cutting into the wood. Cracks spiderwebbed along the beams. "You have to do it now," Mrs. Hale said, "before it realizes." I took the ribbon she'd given me and wrapped it around the base of the cross. Not gently, I pulled until the knot strained. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Closing it." I spoke louder then, raising my voice over the rising sound of the forest outside, the roots grinding, trees bending inward. "This chapel no longer serves. Its service is ended." The words felt heavy, final. The congregation screamed, not in rage, in grief. The sound tore through the hollow, echoing back from every slope. The ledger burst into flame on the altar, pages curling inward without smoke. Names vanished one by one. The cross split down the middle. The ground beneath the chapel lurched violently, throwing me to my knees. Mrs. Hale fell beside me, still singing, even as the ceiling cracked overhead. "Go," she shouted. "Don't look back." I ran. I don't remember reaching the road, only waking at dawn in the ditch, the sound of birds ringing painfully loud in my ears. When I returned later with county officials, there was nothing left of Blackroot Chapel. No rubble, no foundation, just a clearing where the trees had collapsed inward, roots tangled tightly together as if sealing something away. Mrs. Hale was never found, neither was Caldwell. The diocese quietly marked the property as condemned and removed it from their records. No memorial, no investigation. I left Kentucky that same week. Years have passed since then. Sometimes when I'm driving late at night and pass a small country church with its lights still on long after dark, I feel a chill. I wonder how many services are being held out of faith and how many out of fear. Because some places don't ask for belief, they ask for attendance. And if you keep showing up long enough, they will make sure you never leave.
The first thing I noticed about Pine Ridge wasn't the silence. It was the waiting. The town sat high enough in the mountains that clouds passed through it instead of over it, drifting between houses like unwanted guests. There was no town square, no real center, just a long main road with buildings scattered along it as if they'd stopped wherever the climb became too exhausting. I arrived in October of 1983, sent by the state to fill in as a temporary high school history teacher. The previous teacher had left abruptly mid-semester. No forwarding address, no explanation beyond family reasons. Pine Ridge High School was small, 2 stories, red brick, built in the 1940s. The bell tower stood above the entrance, but there was no bell inside it. I learned that my first day. "What do you use instead?" I asked the principal, Mr. Kessler. He smiled thinly. "We don't. Classes changed when they changed. Teachers knew the schedule, students followed it. No one questioned that arrangement, and I learned quickly not to. The kids were polite, too polite. They stood when I entered the room, addressed me as sir, never spoke unless called on. It felt less like a classroom and more like a church. On my second day, I noticed something else. Every classroom clock was stopped, all of them frozen at 3:17. I mentioned it in the staff lounge. A few teachers exchanged glances. Someone laughed nervously. "They break," one of them said. "Humidity?" Every clock? I asked. Mr. Kessler cleared his throat. Just teach the material. I did. Weeks passed. The fog thickened. Pine Ridge settled into a routine that felt rehearsed, as if the town were performing itself daily. Shops opened and closed at the same times. People walked the same routes. Conversations repeated almost word for word. And always the waiting. I felt it most in the afternoons. At exactly 3:10, the students would grow restless. Not loud, never loud, but tense, eyes drifting to the windows, hands clenching desks. At 3:17, they would all stand up at once. No bell, no announcement. They just left. I asked one of the older students about it after class. Why 3:17, I said. He hesitated. That's when school ends. But why then? He frowned as if I asked why water was wet. Because that's when it stops. What stops? He didn't answer. The first time I stayed late was by accident. I'd lost track of time grading papers. The halls emptied quietly around me, footsteps fading until the building felt hollow. When I finally looked up, the clock on my desk read 3:17. It hadn't moved. The fog outside the windows had thickened into something almost solid. Sound felt muted, swallowed. I gathered my things and stepped into the hallway. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Not students, too slow, too heavy. They came from the stairwell leading up to the bell tower. I'd been told it was sealed off, unsafe. The footsteps climbed anyway. Then stopped. Something shifted above me, wood creaking, metal groaning. And then, very faintly, I heard a bell ring. Once. The sound was wrong, dull, muffled, as if heard through soil. Every door along the hallway slammed shut at once. I ran. I don't remember getting to my car, only sitting there afterwards, hands shaking, watching fog roll across the windshield while the sound of that bell echoed inside my skull. The next morning, Pine Ridge acted as if nothing had happened. I went straight to Mr. Kessler's office. "There's a bell," I said. "I heard it." He closed the door behind me carefully. "No," he said, "you didn't. I stayed late, after 3:17. His face tightened. "You shouldn't do that." "Why?" He sat down slowly. "Because the bell doesn't dismiss students." "What does it do then?" He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was barely above a whisper. "It calls attendance." I laughed before I could stop myself. "That's not funny." "I'm not joking." He opened a drawer and slid a ledger across the desk. It was old, leather-bound, pages yellowed and warped. Names filled the pages, rows and rows of them. Every page ended the same way. A name circled in red. A date. 3:17. "These are former students," he said. "And teachers." My stomach dropped. "They died?" he asked. "Some," he said. "Some didn't." "What happens at 3:17? He met my eyes, and for the first time since I'd arrived in Pine Ridge, the waiting I'd felt settled fully into me. "That's when the town takes its count," he said. "And if someone is still here?" The bell tower creaked above us, just slightly. "Then they're marked present."
I didn't leave Pine Ridge that day. I told myself it was because I needed answers, because abandoning a teaching post without notice would raise questions, because running without proof would make me look unstable. The truth was simpler. The waiting had its hooks in me now. After speaking with Mr. Kessler, I noticed how carefully everyone avoided the subject of time. Watches were rare. Phones barely worked. The post office didn't stamp hours, only dates. Even the church down the road held service without announcing when it began or ended. Everything in Pine Ridge existed in relation to 317. That evening, I sat with Mrs. Donnelly, the English teacher, over a quiet dinner at her home. She'd been there longer than anyone else on staff, 23 years. "She should go," she said, stirring her soup without looking at me. "Why didn't you?" I asked. She paused. "I tried." Years earlier, she'd packed her car and driven out just after sunrise. The road down the mountain twisted as usual, fog thick but manageable. Then, without warning, she found herself passing the school again. Same bend, same trees. No matter how long she drove, Pine Ridge repeated itself. "The road only works if you leave before you're counted," she said. "And if you don't?" She finally looked up. "Then you belong to the schedule." That night, I studied the ledger Mr. Kessler had shown me. The earliest entries dated back to 1919, when Pine Ridge was still a logging town. A bell had been installed at the school to regulate shifts, children released early to work, adults rotating in and out of the mills. When the industry collapsed, the bell remained. At first, it rang to dismiss, then to warn, then, according to one margin note written in a shaky hand, to remember. I found records of a landslide in 1924, dozens killed, bodies never recovered. After that, the bell rang only once a day. Attendance was taken. The first disappearance happened the year after. A boy named Samuel Pike stayed after school to clean chalkboards. The bell rang at 3:17. He was never seen again. His name was circled in red. No death certificate, no grave, just absence. The next day, his desk was empty. The class continued. I asked Mr. Kessler why the town didn't leave en masse. He gave me a tired smile. "The bell keeps things orderly." I began noticing small things after that. At 3:15, dogs stopped barking. At 3:16, the fog thickened, rolling in as if summoned. At 3:17, everything held still. One afternoon, I forced myself to stay. I sat at my desk, heart pounding, watching the second hand of my wristwatch inch forward. 3:16, 3:17. The school exhaled. The bell rang, not above me, but inside the walls, a low, resonant tone that vibrated through bone. I felt it pass through my chest, through my teeth. Something moved in the hallway. Slow. Dragging. I didn't look. When the sound faded, I checked the ledger. A new name had appeared. Not circled. Underlined. That night, the fog pressed against my windows harder than ever before. I dreamed of rows of desks stretching into darkness, each occupied by a motionless figure waiting for instruction. In the dream, the bell never stopped ringing. The next morning, one of my students was missing. No announcement, no concern. His classmates didn't even glance at the empty chair. "He was present yesterday," I said. Mrs. Donnelly nodded. "Then he isn't today." I realized then that Pine Ridge didn't punish those who stayed late. It kept them. Presence was consent. I packed my things before lunch. At 3 o'clock, I got in my car. At 3:05, the engine stalled. At 3:10, the fog rolled in thick enough to erase the road. At 3:16, the bell tower groaned. I looked at the dashboard clock. Frozen. 3:17. The bell rang. When it stopped, the
The car started on its own. I was still in the school parking lot. Mr. Kessler stood nearby, hands folded, watching me with something that looked like pity. "You're on tomorrow's schedule," he said. That night, I found a red circle drawn faintly around my name in the ledger. Not closed. Not yet.
I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the bell, not ringing, not fully, just the echo of it, like a sound remembered by the walls. The fog outside my window pulsed in slow waves, pressing close, retreating, as if breathing. At 2:40 a.m., I made a decision. If Pine Ridge ran on a schedule, then the only way out was to leave between moments before the town could decide whether I was present or not. I packed nothing, no suitcase, no books, just my wallet and the ledger page I'd torn out with my name half-circled in red. The road was clear when I started driving, too clear. No fog, no wind. The forest stood frozen, listening. At 3:05, my watch began to vibrate, not ring, just shake, until the screen went black. At 3:10, the fog returned all at once, swallowing the road ahead like a curtain being pulled shut. At 3:14, the radio crackled to life. Static, then voices. Children reciting names. My students. My name came last. I slammed the accelerator. The engine screamed in protest as the engine strained uphill. The fog thinned just enough for me to see the school ahead, impossibly close, the bell tower rising through the mist like a finger pointing straight at me. "No," I whispered, "not again." The bell rang. This time it didn't stop. The sound deepened, stretched, becoming something physical. The road dissolved beneath my tires, replaced by the hallway of the school. Lockers lined the sides, dented and rusted, stretching farther than they ever had in reality. My car rolled to a stop at the base of the bell tower stairs. The door opened on its own. I climbed. Each step was marked with names carved into the wood: students, teachers, caretakers, some so worn they were barely legible. At the top, the bell hung from thick, root-like cables that disappeared into the ceiling, pulsing slowly. It wasn't metal anymore. It was bone. The bell rang again, and the ledger page in my hand burned hot. The red circle around my name completed itself, ink spreading like blood. I understood then. The bell didn't keep time. It kept memory. Pine Ridge existed because it refused to forget. Every person counted, recorded, preserved in the moment they were last present. Leaving meant erasure, and the town would not allow that. Someone had to remain to remember everyone else. A caretaker. A witness. The ringing stopped. The fog outside receded. I don't remember agreeing, but I remembered the silence afterward, and how gentle it felt. When morning came, I was sitting at my desk. Class began at 8. The students filed in, calm and quiet. One more desk had been added to the room, already worn, as if it had always been there. At 3:17, they stood and left. I did not. Years have passed since then. The town still waits. The bell still rings once a day. And sometimes, when a new teacher arrives and asks why there's no bell schedule, I smile and tell them the truth. You don't need one. Time already knows where you are. And if they stay too late, I make sure to write their name down carefully, so Pine Ridge doesn't forget them.